When it comes to foreign affairs, I tend to be aligned with the realist school. Now, there's a bunch of different theories as to how foreign relations between countries work, but the realist school focuses on analyzing and understanding international relations by looking at the motivations of the various state actors and trying to view them as rational actors. That is, trying to figure out what the various pressures are on them, why they're acting the way they are, not assuming that it's things are motivated by, I guess, kind of craziness or necessarily individual personalities or ideological motivations, but trying to see, is there a rational reason why they're behaving a certain way? And that's more important, at least in my books, than necessarily the minutia of what's happening on the daily basis. So, that being said, as you've probably heard, the United States has assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, who is the leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard of Iran's Quds Force, which is kind of an elite paramilitary organization. So this has sparked fears that Iran and America are finally going to have their face off. This is something they've been really dancing around since the Iranian Revolution. And there's been all kinds of proxy wars, there's been all kinds of very close calls, but it's never really gotten to open all-out warfare between the two. So some people are saying either this is going to be an opportunity for Iran to really kind of step up, pursuing their geopolitical interests more aggressively, or this is going to lead to some sort of open conflict between the United States and Iran, and it might involve some other anti-Iranian country. So it's very hard to predict what will happen exactly, because we've had so many close calls, and it always seems that both sides back down at the last minute. So kind of rather than that, let's just take a look at what's been happening, how we came to this point, and what the motivations of the various actors are. So, if we talk about the immediate cause of the drone strike or whatever it was, we have to keep in mind that there was an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad on December 31st, where a group of protesters stormed the U.S. Embassy, actually because of a U.S. airstrike on a militia group, which had happened because I believe the militia group or an allied militia group killed a U.S. contractor. So my point being that this isn't just like America necessarily woke up one morning and said, let's kill a major Iranian commander. There's been a lot of tit for tat. There's been a lot of them going back and forth. It's not like Iran and the U.S., or at least the U.S. and Iranian-backed militias, haven't been fighting over the last couple of months. I see a lot of people kind of interpreting this as being in a vacuum. But that's very rarely the case. There's often a direct kind of event that instigates it. Now you can say this was justified or not justified, but my point is this isn't just a random crazy action on the US's part. Now, something you have to keep in mind with any great power or superpower is that the illusion or the impression of dominance or the impression of power is often more important than power itself. A great deal of whoever's in charge, be it the Soviet Union, be it the United States, be it Britain, be it France, whoever, a great deal of their authority derives from the fact that there's an inherent threat. That is, if you screw with us, if you interfere with with our interests, we're going to meet you with overwhelming force. So that being said, to a certain extent, if somebody does something to a great power, like when the Chechens attacked that Russian school, or in this case, when an Iranian-backed militia attacks the U.S. Embassy, or another good example of this is when 9/11 happened and the Taliban was hiding Osama bin Laden. To a certain extent, the U.S. feels obligated to go and do something because they have to maintain, whether it's real or not, the impression that they are still a great power, that they are not someone you can just do this kind of thing to. You have to take immediate and strong force to maintain this impression. So, at a very basic level, warmongering aside, Israel aside, other kind of spurious variables aside, the US may feel obligated to do something about this. Once again, if you look at the proxy war in the Middle East, with the US being allied with Israel and Saudi Arabia, regardless of how you feel about the morality of the different sides, at a certain level, the US feels they have to, now that they've made this commitment, they can't just run away, they can't fully disengage. And if Iran does something against, whether or not it's actually in the US's national interest is irrelevant. If they don't do something when Iran threatens their geopolitical interests this time, then next time someone might take the perspective, oh, okay, so we're just going to do this because the US is passive and they're not going to get involved. And this is kind of the issue, and I think this is one of the reasons why the US is having such trouble disengaging from Afghanistan. Because at this point in time, if they do leave without there being any kind of resolution to the conflict, it's going to look really bad on them. Although in that case, there's also the issue that Afghanistan will probably become a terrorist state that just all the various Islamic groups move to. But that's neither here nor there. So my point being that warmongering aside, Israel aside, there is a logical reason at a very basic level why the US has to keep doing this kind of thing with Iran. So that's kind of the US's motivation. And we can get into the background behind this, like with the Israeli lobby, with their alliance with Saudi Arabia and the various other Gulf states, etc. But the US, rightly or wrongly, perceives an anti-Iran policy to be in their geopolitical interest. And whenever Iran pushes back against that, they feel obligated to push back against the pushback, I suppose you could say. So that's kind of one of the factions involved with this. And part of this issue is you have a bunch of different factions, most of whom are facing political instability. The US's political situation is very complex. Trump may want to start a war or do saber rattling to help his chances in the next election, or he may not. Trump's overall control of the government seems to be very tenuous at best, and most of his own administration is undermining him. So we don't really know who the hell is in power. And once again, even if Trump doesn't do something, he is kind of obligated to pretend that he did it or say, yeah, I ordered that attack. Because the idea that all these people are going behind his back and ordering drone strikes and stuff is worse than him doing these kind of things. It's better if he looks like he's crazy or a warmonger or violent than that he has absolutely no control of the US military and the US state. So that's kind of just at a very basic level what I think the US's kind of rational motivations are in this. So if we look at the bigger picture, there's been an ongoing proxy war, an ongoing a kind of Cold War, but really almost more violent and more direct than the actual Cold War was. So there's the pro-Iran side and the anti-Iran side. The anti-Iran side led by Saudi Arabia and Israel, and the pro-Iran side obviously led by Iran. Now, I think someone you could add to this would be ISIS, who I'd put on the pro-Saudi Arabia side, because it's well known ISIS received a bunch of money from and weapons from the Gulf states. Israel seems to have been supporting them, and the U.S. government was supporting them. And they were very staunchly anti-Iran, and they were primarily fighting against the Syrian government, which is pro-Iran, and the Iraqi government, which is pro-Iran. And other theaters of the war didn't seem to be particularly important to them by comparison. And they didn't really make any attempt to attack Israel, which has kind of been the traditional enemy since it became a country of most Islamist groups. The actual status of some of the other players in the conflict, like Afghanistan, Pakistan, we don't really know about. There's kind of some other looser members of the anti-Iran coalition. I think you could maybe argue that the Muslim Brotherhood and its various subsidiaries, such as the Arab Gathering or obviously the Muslim Brotherhood, or just some of the other local parties, could be non-state actors in the anti-Iran coalition. So why is there an anti-Iran coalition to begin with? Um, to that, I'm not sure if we should really talk about that first or talk about Iran first. So maybe we'll just put a bookmark in that for a moment and let's go on and talk about Iran and why Iran seems to be being aggressive and why you have the anti-Iran coalition reacting to it. So Iran has been in a very unstable political situation pretty much since the Shah fell. There was a period where Ayatollah Khomeini was in power, and he was more or less able to run it as a totalitarian state with immense popular support. Now, one of the issues that's kind of come across is, as with a lot of Western countries, the younger generation is a lot more secular. In many cases, they're atheist or socially liberal or that kind of thing, and they despise the existing clericalist order. Also, just from an outsider's perspective, it appears that Iran is becoming more democratic over time, and that they're called principalists in Iran, or the kind of Islamist clericalist faction, has pretty much continually been losing momentum over the last couple of elections. So Iran is a weird case where it's kind of a semi-democracy. It's very hard to describe Iran's political system. I studied it back in university, and a lot of the source material I read said it really depends upon who's in power, etc. A lot of the people on the various principalist or reformist factions are in it for self-interest to just loot state oil resources. So it's very hard to tell what's even going on. But let's just look at a couple of previous Iranian elections. So obviously, kind of what started all of this was when Ahmadinejad came to power back in 2005, and he was a firebrand, and he took a very aggressive stance towards Israel, the United States, etc. So he won pretty handily, and he was the head of one of the main principalist parties. So that happened, and then he was able to win re-election easily in 2009. Now we had the 2013 election, and the Green Movement happened, where a lot of young Iranians wanted reform, they wanted liberalism, they wanted more direct democracy, and the whole thing just like it just became a total disaster zone. So that happened, and then in 2013, despite the repression, we had the reformists win again. Or I guess in this case it was a centrist, but once again, the principalists did not win. And then we head into 2011, or rather 2017, and the Iranian reformists won a pretty strong victory. And now we're going to be heading into 2021, and who knows, the reformists might win again. So I think the Islamic government in Iran is probably getting very worried because the conservatives keep seeming to be losing ground, and they haven't really won a presidential election in over a decade at this point in time. Plus, there's just been continual demographics seem to be gradually moving against the conservatives as the younger generation is increasingly secular. Plus, there's a lot of just economic problems in Iran, largely caused by sanctions. The actual nature of the Islamic State was never really clearly established. Iran is just kind of a political, economic, and social mess at the moment. And there's a very real concern that a combination of internal and external pressures could lead to the regime being taken down. So it's very common for regimes, particularly unstable ones, to pursue an aggressive foreign policy to distract people from what's going on at home. Whether that's just to give them something else to focus on, or if they're opposed to the foreign policy, to direct their anger elsewhere. There's also just a more, I guess you could say, geopolitical issue. Iran has pretty much been isolated ever since the Shah was overthrown. A big issue with it is just that Iran is and they probably want at least some allies beyond just Russia. There's a lot of reasons for this. It's so they can trade with somebody. Maybe they can do some kind of indirect thing where they trade with one of their allies, and then their allies trade with countries that they're they're otherwise blocked from trading with. I know historically the US has restrictions on that, but there are often ways of getting around that sort of thing. Also, Iran probably just wants to end its political isolation, and having some sort of counter coalition to the Saudi Arabia Israel coalition, I think it's just something that they're interested in for very obvious reasons. And they've had a couple successes lately. Yemen was briefly taken over by the Houthis, if that's how you pronounce it, who are a pro-Iranian Shia group. Although that's turned into kind of just a complete, like, disaster zone where neither side seems to be really winning at the moment. Lebanon is, I believe, currently more pro-Iran than it is pro-Western or pro-anti-Iran. Lebanon is just another disaster zone. Syria is actually, it appears Iran has more or less succeeded there. Assad's going to win. Some sort of agreement is going to come to fruition with the Kurds, and Iran will have at least one reliable ally. Interestingly enough, with access to the Mediterranean once the conflict is formally over. So, much as with the Cold War, there's a feeling that the non-Western side is isolated, and they want to try to put together a military, political, and economic bloc that is self-sufficient or that can adequately challenge the West. And this may help Iran's longer-term political survival. It also probably helps, as I said, distract both the liberals and the real hardliners from the domestic situation. So that being said, I think Iran's motivation, this is once again rational, as is the United States' motivation. So then we have Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has really dug themselves into a hole. So the Saudis have, for the last, I think it's more than 100 years at this point, maybe 200 years, been ruled by Wahhabists, which are a puritanical sect within Sunnism that are just like the most radical group. And the various offshoots of that are things have given birth to stuff like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And in most countries, if there is some sort of Islamist group or terrorist group, they're allied with Wahhabism or Salafism or some other kind of ideological descendant of Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has funded mosques throughout the world and imposed imams in them that have preached violence and preached Islamism. That's why you have cases like in a lot of places where the Muslims were historically rather moderate, like in the Balkans, I believe in the Caucasus to a certain extent, actually, and Southeast Asia, where it's become a much more violent and unstable situation. And that, I believe, is because more or less what happened is everybody hated the Wahhabists. The Ottoman Empire would periodically invade and kill as many as they could get their hands on. But since Saudi Arabia got oil money, they were able to develop very rapidly. And I'd imagine initially there was a very strong ideological religious motivation for this spreading. But as time goes on, there is a large underclass who has really grown to, well, not really underclass, because they're still wealthier than most of the world's population, but a group of true believers in Salafism and Wahhabism who's come to find the increasingly decadent and secular upper class as being unacceptable. They don't necessarily want to be continued to be ruled by the hedonistic, decadent Al-Saud dynasty. A lot of them probably want the Islamic Republic of Arabia or something like that. So Saudi Arabia is kind of in a position where they have to keep funding these people. They have to keep shoving mice in the head in the face of the viper they're trying to struggle with. But I mean, the viper's getting bigger all the time, and eventually it's not going to be. They aren't going to be able to keep holding it at bay because they're strengthening what's ultimately going to be their destruction. And a lot of the various regimes in this area also have this undercurrent, and there's real fears that there's going to be another green wave, and that Islamism is going to sweep across the Middle East. And the Saudis kind of want this and kind of don't want this. So they're facing a huge amount of political instability. If oil prices ever really go down more than they already have, it's going to lead to just a complete shit show. And we might see, like I said, the Saudi regime collapsing. This could lead to global oil supplies getting disrupted. It just would be a disaster zone. So the Saudis are like, okay, so we can't really rely on other Muslim countries because a lot of them hate us at this point in time. So they've chosen to throw in their lot with the United States and Israel as their allies, which is interesting because both are kind of the polar opposites of them. But their interests are more aligned with the Saudi royal family and the ruling class than I imagine at this point the Saudi ruling class are with the various Islamist groups. I'd also imagine as kind of what Franco did during World War II, sending the most radical members of Saudi society to go fight these proxy wars is a way to get them out of the country and maybe kill some of them off. That's kind of Saudi Arabia's motivation in this. You also have Turkey, and no one really knows what Turkey's doing. To the best of my understanding, Turkey is by far the most powerful country militarily in the Middle East. They have a large, well-trained, modern army. The Turkish economy is based on industry and services, not on oil. And Turkey has a very strong nationalist government. It's not nearly as politically unstable. And there's been fears that since Erdogan has abandoned basically the EU and Europe, that he might be trying to reform the Ottoman Empire, or at least reasserting Turkey as the hegemon of the Middle East. So they're kind of a wild card in this whole thing. The U.S. has alienated them. Historically, Turkey has been very pro-U.S., very pro-West, and very enthusiastic about their membership in NATO. But when the Americans and the various Western powers started arming people who were actively fighting the Turkish government and who they perceive as terrorist groups, things weren't really going very well. So who knows what direction Turkey's going exactly? If they're going to go in a pro-Russia direction, if they're going to strike out on their own, because they are frankly strong enough to strike out on their own, and what their geopolitical ambitions are going to be. So we have all these different factions. In some cases, we don't know what they're doing, like Turkey. In other cases, you have a lot of people facing extreme instability and are basically, to quote Benjamin Sisko, war may be our only choice because we're losing the peace. So that's kind of the background there. Now let's talk a bit about what's been going on in Iraq. So Iraq has been a disaster zone, obviously, ever since the invasion of Iraq by the United States back in 2000. And things have been going downhill pretty much since then. Or sort of. So Iraq has historically, it's been very unstable for a very long time. But there was, I don't know if you'd call it stability, but up until the latest election, the parliament was generally dominated by regional, mostly Shia pro-Iran parties, and regional Kurdistani parties would kind of be the junior coalition in the government. Now, the electoral system in Iraq is really, really complicated. It doesn't make a lot of sense. There's all kinds of parties that go back and forth between various alliances and coalitions. But broadly speaking, let's just look at some various results. So the first election, the pro-Iran Islamist group, Shia Muslims won an absolute majority. I'm sure there's some other Shia groups that also partook in that. Once again, you had a majority. I believe there was a coalition between the main Shia group and some of the other ones. But once again, the Shias won the election. Now we head into 2010, and once again, we have largely a Shia victory. Nuri al-Maliki becomes prime minister, opposed to al-Hod for quite a bit of time. If we look at the government formation in this case, you had once again, it was kind of a mess, but it was, from my understanding at least, largely dominated by the Shias. They at least held the balance or the plurality of power. The 2014 election saw the Shias pick up a bunch of seats. If we look at them, yeah, like just yeah. So they won that election as well. I think that was the best they ever did, to be honest. And then we head into the 2018 election, and it just turns into like a complete and utter like nobody even knows like what's going on. I think it took like 5 months or something for the government to be formed. So if we look at like let's look at the various parties that are composed the current government, because it's like really really weird. So the largest party is the Marching Towards Reform, which is a merger of a couple Shia parties and the Communist Party. I'm not joking. I'm not making this up. So there's them. Then there is a moderate Islamist party. We have like a couple other secular, centrist, or liberal parties. So like if we look at like who's currently in power, okay, so we have the Communist Shia Party. We have a more radical Shia party. We have a Kurdish party. Let's see, another centrist party. I guess there's another like moderate Shia party, and there's some other like liberal reformist party, and it's just kind of like a bit of a mess at the moment. In particular, the main Shia party, the State of Law Coalition, lost power in the last election. So, from my understanding, things have been kind of shaky ever since that happened. You also, of course, had all the stuff with ISIS. You had multiple Iraqi civil wars, and you have the continuing influence of Iran. And kind of the Iraqi government has been more and more reliant upon the Iranian support in order to maintain power. Now, another thing to keep in mind that I think people fail to understand is what the demographic situation is like. So this is from a while back, but as you can see, southeastern Iraq and Kurdistan are the areas that have the highest fertility rate, whereas the Sunni areas have a much lower one. And over the course of the last decade, the demographic situation has really changed a lot. So prior, the Shia were a majority of the population. They were about 60%, whereas by 2017, they are now 70%. So they're a super majority of the population. Now, this looks deceptive because this makes Sunni Islam look bigger than it actually is. Because within the context of Sunnis, 15% of that is Kurd. So non-Kurdish Sunnis are only about 10% of the Iraqi population. So the Arab Sunnis, who were kind of the basis of the Ba'athist regime, are a very small portion of the population at this point in time. So you have a situation under which it seems, at least from what I was able to determine, but it's a bit like Brazil and a lot of other countries, where the political parties are just kind of a mess, and it's really hard to tell like what's even going on. But where the demographics are heading in a Shia direction, and a lot of the institutions are heading in a pro-Iran direction, but it seems like the pro-Iranian parties had some difficulties in the recent elections, and of course there's widespread accusations of fraud. So as part of them defeating ISIS, Iraq's standing army is actually way smaller than I thought it was. The entire Iraqi armed forces is only 64,000 people, which is insanely tiny to me compared to how much military stuff they go through. But the Shia militias, which are basically under government control at this point in time, are like 150,000 to 300,000. And they kind of became part of the Iraqi defense apparatus during the war against ISIS. So you have a situation under which you have a Shia Muslim group, a series of Shia Muslim groups that are only under semi-government control but have official status that are much larger than the actual army. You also have all kind of Iranian proxy militias and stuff like that. So you have a very dominant Shia position in Iraq. And there's a continual inability, at least it seems recently, for the pro Iranian parties to win an absolute majority and kind of go back to how things seem to have been. Once again, I did look into this. It's very difficult to tell what the hell actually happened politically. And once again, as with a lot of countries, there's widespread fraud in elections. No one really knows what's going on. They have a very complex electoral system. So it's just kind of a mess politically, but the Shias are definitely in ascendancy, even if they've had setbacks. I've heard people say the last election was rigged by the US and Israel, and part of what's going on now is the pro Iranian faction are kind of preparing to perform some sort of coup in order to regain the initiative. But so everything is kind of like, I don't know if a mess is the right term, but it's very much kind of up in the air. And this is kind of the background where we're looking at. Iran might say, okay, this is our chance to overthrow the existing political order and permanently kind of make Iraq our client state. Because as I said, if you look at the demographics, Shias have a supermajority, particularly outside of Kurdistan, and to a certain extent, you could probably exclude Kurdistan as they kind of do their own thing. And if this situation kind of gets worse and worse for the Sunnis, then who knows, they might get more and more radical. It's interesting that the Baathists allied themselves with ISIS largely during the most recent Iraqi civil war, despite being kind of the secular nationalist party. So that's kind of the backdrop that we're looking at, and kind of who the various factions are, what their interests are, and kind of how that's brought us to our current standpoint. So hopefully that was interesting. I know this went really long, but there was a lot of ground to cover. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll try to cover this situation a bit as time goes on.